All right, when you picture a border, what usually comes to mind? You're probably thinking of physical things, right? Concrete walls, barbed wire fences, heavily guarded checkpoints. But what if I told you that modern borders are actually built out of things like spreadsheets, statistics, and bureaucratic labels? In today's Explainer, we're diving into some incredibly fascinating research on how migration data goes way beyond just, counting people. We're going to unpack how the exact numbers and terms used by authorities actively construct this concept of the fake illegal. It is a real game changer for how you view global migration. So here is the fundamental question we really need to tackle first. How do simple statistics and administrative labels transform people who are literally just seeking safety into an imminent security threat? I mean, it's so easy to assume data is completely neutral. We tend to think of numbers as cold, hard, objective facts. But the research we're exploring today argues something entirely different. It suggests that the specific way we categorize a human being on a bureaucratic form completely dictates how entire societies perceive them and ultimately how governments end up treating them. Just picture a bustling, vibrant scene right by the Eiffel Tower. You see everyday people grabbing coffee, going about their day. It's a beautiful snapshot of Paris. But overlaying this deeply human reality is an invisible, rigid grid of data. And the research shows us that this data is not just a passive observation, it's an active border-making tool. The categories applied to the people walking those Parisian streets literally shape public perception and drive highly securitized policies. A simple label decided in an office miles and miles away changes whether a person in that crowd is viewed by the state as a neighbor, a victim in need, or a criminal. Let's peel back the first layer of this with Section 1, the weaponization of terminology. If you look at the historical timeline, it reveals this chilling semantic shift over the decades. Back in 1951, the international standard was asylum seeker, a term that's firmly grounded in human rights and international law. But watch how this morphs. By the 1980s and 90s, the public discourse shifted into this intense moral panic around the so-called bogus refugee. Then, moving into the 2000s, institutions adopted the term irregular migrant, which sounds neutral, but still heavily marginalizes folks. At every single step, the language slowly chips away at the presumption of innocence and erases the recognition that a person might genuinely need sanctuary. And in 2022, this whole trend really hit a climax. Frontex, which is the European Border Agency, officially changed its terminology from irregular to illegal. Now, that is not just some casual swap of vocabulary. By actively choosing the word illegal, the official narrative shifts to explicitly criminalizing the most basic human search for safety. The source material highlights that this semantic choice actively pushes a narrative of an imminent security threat, and that, in turn, is used to justify much tougher border measures against people who, just a few decades ago, were simply recognized as asylum seekers. Which brings us right to Section 2, the geographic anatomy of border crossings. When authorities and headlines are constantly screaming about a massive border crisis of illegals, the actual hard data tells a profoundly different story. To put this into perspective, individuals fleeing Syria have a 94.4% asylum acceptance rate. For Eritrea, it's 87.4%. Iraq sits at 70.6%. These are real people fleeing active war zones and systemic persecution, and domestic courts are overwhelmingly recognizing them as legitimate refugees. Now, yes, there are groups with high rejection rates, like those from Albania or Morocco, but the overwhelming bulk of this so-called crisis is actually driven by people with incredibly high legal acceptance rates. The data fundamentally destroys the myth of the fake illegal. So when all these individual humans get dumped into a massive statistical bucket labeled illegal border crossings, the human context is entirely wiped out. All those diverse faces sharing the streets of a city like Paris? Erased. The fact that an individual making a crossing has a 94% chance of being legally recognized as a refugee under international law gets completely buried under a heavy, bureaucratic labels slapped on them at the border. All right, moving on to Section 3, navigating mixed migration realities. If there is one massive takeaway you get from this explainer, it should be that human movement is almost never just black and white. Mixed migration is the term used to define the incredibly complex journeys of people who are forced, literally by sheer necessity, to weave back and forth across these invisible lines of legality just to survive. Because legal pathways are so incredibly limited today, a single person might enter a country legally on a visa, overstay and be labeled irregular, apply for asylum and become legal again while it's pending, and if rejected, become illegal.
all of this happens without them ever physically moving from the city they're in. The human stays exactly the same. It's literally just the data label that keeps changing.
Think about the Nepali case study highlighted in the research, which really perfectly grounds this whole abstract concept. Real people from Nepal arrive in Europe driven by intense economic necessity or complex local pressures. Once they get there, they have to navigate the exact same convoluted European labeling systems as anyone else. We see them constantly transitioning back and forth across that legal and illegal divide as they manage the geographical boundaries between places like France and the UK, sharing the very same streets as English and French individuals. It is a constant, exhausting administrative tightrope walk.
Let's zoom out a bit for Section 4, Europe's Great Policy Contradiction.
It is basically a tale of two entirely different systems. On one hand, you have Europe's external borders. Out there, we see heavy militarization. We're talking exploding budgets, razor wire fences, and a highly securitized stance that is almost entirely fueled by Frontex's aggregated illegal crossing numbers. The external system treats arriving people strictly as a criminal security threat. But internally, domestic ministries and state courts process those exact same populations, and guess what they do? They look at the individual human context, they apply international law, and they grant them asylum, recognizing their fundamental basic right to protection. So Europe is simultaneously doing two completely contradictory things. It is physically fighting off, at a massive financial and human cost, the very individuals that its own internal justice systems eventually recognize as human beings totally deserving of sanctuary. It's crazy when you think about it. The data label of illegal builds a physical militarized wall, while the legal reality of refugee eventually opens a door. It really is a profound systemic paradox. We literally allow bureaucratic numbers and shifting terminology to build militarized borders against the exact same humans that our own domestic courts eventually deem worthy of safety. It just shows you how much immense power is hiding inside a simple spreadsheet. I really hope this explainer has transformed how you view the data, the labels, and the deeply human realities behind global migration. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. The next time you see a statistic about border crossings on the news, ask yourself, what human story is being entirely erased by that number?